Okay, this is lecture number 6 in our series, and we're still in this period we call the Christian Empire period. This period spanning some 1,200 years, from approximately the year 312 to the year 1500. In our past lectures, we've looked at some of the general trends and characteristics, how first Christianity became officially allowed, then officially supported by the Roman Empire, and that this was a huge significant thing. And then, of course, we saw how Christianity retreated to the monastery. The monastic movement is very prominent. And then the emergence of the Roman Catholic Church and the institution of papacy. Sort of as a very dominant sub-theme on all three of those was the fall of the Roman Empire, right? And then the efforts in the European consciousness to revive the Roman Empire. When Charlemagne was crowned king, crowned emperor over a revived Roman Empire, it was a very conscious attempt to get back to the glory of Rome that they once had. And all throughout the medieval period, this thinking persisted, this desire, this instinct. We need to get back to this strength that they once had. But in this lecture, we're not going to talk more about these basic trends and characteristics. We're going to talk about some of the important events and challenges of the period of the Christian Empire. And we're going to begin with the Arian heresy and the Council of Nicaea. You know, through our last lecture, when we described the rise of papal power and this ongoing conflict between the popes and the kings, you know, that was a gradual thing that unfolded over many hundreds of years. And when we left our discussion, we were, in the year 1200 or something like that. Well, we are discussing a very long period of history. And I want you to sort of hit the rewind button and go back almost to the very beginning of this Christian Empire period. And we'll talk now about the Council of Nicaea and the Arian heresy. The Arian heresy began in the early 4th century with a popular elder. We would call him a pastor, but a popular elder in the Christian community of Alexandria, Egypt. Arius called himself a Christian, but he emphasized ideas in Greek philosophy and theology. Ideas that said God is completely unique and unknowable. This was a very strong idea in Greek philosophy. God is completely unique and unknowable. Because Jesus lived as a man, he could be known. Therefore, in Arius' thinking, Jesus couldn't be God. You couldn't know God the way that you could know Jesus, right? In Arius' thinking, because he was influenced by Greek philosophy. Arius believed that Jesus was like God. In fact, he believed that Jesus was the most God-like of all creatures. Nevertheless, ultimately, Jesus was just the highest being in the universe, but he was still a creature, he was not God. Arius' teaching had a very big appeal for many reasons. First, it was consistent with deeply ingrained ways of thinking found in Greek culture. In Arius' teaching, Jesus was more like one of the divine human heroes of Greek mythology than he was like the Jesus of the Bible, right? And second, Arius was an excellent preacher and communicator. Third, Arius was good at marketing. And he even put some of his central ideas into what we would call today jingles. You know, quick songs that people can sing and they're memorable and they stick in your mind, right? You know, something from a commercial or something like that gets stuck in your mind. Arius was a brilliant marketer. And he knew how to present his ideas in a way that would connect with people and stick in their minds. These ideas of Arius were popular and they were on the lips of the common people. Gregory of Nyssa spoke, again in the 4th century. He spoke on the popularity of the Arian debate. He says, if you ask anyone in Constantinople for change, he'll start discussing with you whether or not the Son is begotten or unbegotten. If you ask about the quality of the bread, you'll get the answer, the Father is greater, the Son less. If you suggest taking a bath, you'll be told, there was nothing before the Son was created. I love this quote from Gregory of Nyssa. It shows that he was very aware that the common people were talking about theology. You go up to a guy and say, hey, can I have some change for this, for this money? Get some change? And the guy immediately says, hey, do you think the Son of God is begotten or unbegotten? These things were on the lips, in the minds of common people. It was a huge thing at this time in church history. Now, we discussed this a little bit before about how Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, condemned and excommunicated Arius. When he did that, it caused a huge controversy because he condemned and excommunicated a popular guy. The Emperor Constantine called together a church council in Nicaea in the year 325 to decide the issue. And sometimes you'll see these movies where they have a time machine and you can go back to some period of time. Somewhere probably in the top 10 or top 20 places I'd like to go if I could get into a time machine is I would love to go and be at the Council of Nicaea. Because you have to remember the context of the Council of Nicaea. By the year 325, persecution was over in the Roman Empire, but not for very long. And what you had was like an all-star team of Christian leaders who had lived through some of the worst persecution that the Roman Empire could throw at. This was a real gathering of heroes of the faith. More than 300 bishops from churches all over the world gathered at Nicaea, or all over the known world, I should say. Gathered at Nicaea for this conference. And again, since it wasn't so long since the time of persecution, there were many, many people there who had suffered and been tortured for Jesus. And that added a special dimension to the council. Now, Arius appeared, before this council, and he made his case. He claimed that Jesus was a created being, and that he was capable of change, so he could not be God. He presented his best case, the council discussed it, and the council, rightly, I would say, rejected Arius' teaching. Then, the Council of Nicaea went on to make an affirmative statement about the nature of Jesus. This is what they said. They said that he is one true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. Let me read that to you again because it's sort of the critical formulation. True God from true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. Now, one critical phrase is the idea of one substance, which is the Greek word, and I'm going to butcher this, homoousios. Now, I can't distinguish between these in my pronunciation. Between homoousios and homoousios. I don't know. I can't make the distinction in the way my Greek pronunciation is so poor. But what you need to understand is that there's a huge difference. Homoousios says of the same substance. Homoousios says of similar substance. Arius was fine with saying that Jesus was of similar substance as the Father. But he was not down with saying that he was of the same substance. And therefore, Arius and his doctrines were defeated at the Council of Nicaea. You could say right here that a lot was riding on one letter, right? That one letter I that's in the middle of there. Is it homoousios or homoousios? Big difference riding on one letter. Therefore, they came up with the Nicene Creed. And I'm not going to read the whole Nicene Creed to you right now because I'd rather get through our material. But I just want to say that here is the critical phrase in the Nicene Creed that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father from all ages, light of light, true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. In other words, thinking of this. What is God the Father made of? It's sort of a crude conception if you want to take it too literally, but if you just take it in the sense, God the Father is made of God stuff, right? That's his being. What is Jesus made of? He's made of the same God stuff, right? Not creature stuff, but God stuff. That's what Jesus is made of. And so it was a very powerful declaration of the deity of Jesus Christ. Now, I want to impress something upon you with all of my strength. Nobody should think for one moment. When I hear people talk about this, not only is it ignorant, but it angers me. People talking as if the doctrine of the deity of Jesus Christ was invented at the Council of Nicaea. What rubbish! It was invented before time began. It's all over the Scriptures. We don't believe in the deity of Jesus Christ because the Council of Nicaea said it, but we value the analysis of the Council of Nicaea because they precisely phrase and spell out what we understand to be biblical doctrine. But nobody should get the idea that the church was confused about who Jesus was until this time. No. The majority of the church knew from the very, very beginning that Jesus Christ was God. Just as the New Testament spells him out. So sometimes people take these councils. Sometimes you'll hear absurd statements, such as the doctrine of the Trinity wasn't believed or wasn't taught until such and such date, until a certain council said. That's a bunch of nonsense. The doctrine of the Trinity is thoroughly biblical, and it was believed biblically. You going to tell me that the Apostle Paul didn't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity? It's all over his letters. It's woven into the warp and woof, into the very fabric of the New Testament. Now, if you want to say that there was not a precisely, carefully worked through, manufactured statement or creed regarding the Trinity until such and such day, okay, of course there wasn't. But to act as if these doctrines were created at this time, or were not believed popularly before that, is just nonsense. Well, the next bishop of Alexandria, named Athanasius, the first bishop of Alexandria who had to deal with Arius was a guy named Alexander. But he died. Therefore, Athanasius took his place. Athanasius also had to deal with Arius and the Arian heresy. But it was hard. Why was it hard? Because Arius was so popular. And he was so skillful at marketing his ideas. He still had a huge following of people who were convinced that he was right. But Athanasius battled it. And by the way, Athanasius in his battles with authorities, with his battles with Arius, with his battles with everybody, he earned the phrase, Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius against the world. He was just, it seemed like he was always battling. He was just a guy in that kind of position. Right? So, this is the Arian heresy and the Council of Nicaea. If you have questions, you should ask them, because we're going to move on to our next point. The next thing, the dispute about the humanity of Jesus and the Council of Chalcedon. Now, in the first half of the 5th century, another doctrinal challenge arose. This time, the debate was over the nature of Jesus' humanity. The Arian debate was over the nature of Jesus' deity. This controversy was over the nature of Jesus' humanity. Everyone had come to agreement. When I say everyone, I really don't mean that. There was still a strong Arian party that existed for several hundred years. But the recognized official church understood that Jesus was God. But now they were asking questions. What was the nature of his humanity? You see, because in some places, the deity of Jesus was emphasized so much that essentially they denied that he was human. There was a tendency to allow the deity of Jesus to swallow up the humanity of Jesus. Some people taught that Jesus was God on the inside, but he had a human shell. Other people taught, if you were to teach that, you would teach that Jesus wasn't truly human, would you, right? If he's God on the inside, but just has a human shell, it's the same as saying that he's not truly human. He just looks like a human. This view was taught by a man named Apollinarius, and it was known as Apollinarianism. Another challenge was known as Monotheism, coming from mono and physis, which is nature, one nature. This teaching said that Jesus' human nature was dissolved or absorbed or lost in his divine nature. Again, it was another way of denying the humanity of Jesus Christ. The Council of Chalcedon was called in 451 to settle the issue. Amidst a huge amount of political infighting and backbiting, 400 bishops gathered to settle the issue. Now, if the Council of Nicaea was glorious, like an all-star team of those who had survived persecution and made it through the terrible Diocletian persecutions and stuff, the Council of Chalcedon was far less glamorous. It had been around, say 150 years after the church had been approved in the Roman Empire, and it was much, much more political. It was much, much more, just sort of not so glorious as Nicaea. But again, the bishops seemed to do their work well. They settled on this definition. They said that Jesus is recognized in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, the characteristic property of each nature being preserved, coming together to form one person. The Council of Chalcedon declared that Jesus is God and man, one being who has two natures, divine and human. One being was not absorbed into the other, nor was he really two persons, as in a split personality. And what's fascinating about the Council of Chalcedon is they used the word homoiousios. The word that was rejected at Nicaea was accepted at Chalcedon. Do you know why? Because the issue was different at Chalcedon. The issue at Chalcedon was whether or not Jesus and the Father were identical. They were reacting against what we might call a Jesus-only doctrine. Has anybody ever heard of the Jesus-only doctrine? It teaches this, that there's no such thing as the Trinity. That God was the Father, then He became the Son, and that now He's the Holy Spirit. In other words, there's not a Trinity where the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit exist all at the same time. No. That it's sometimes called modalism, where God just has different modes. At one time He was in the mode of the Father, then He was in the mode of the Son, then He was in the mode of the Holy Spirit. By using this phrase of similar substance, they emphasize that God the Father and God the Son are not the same person. And in some ways, we have to give a lot of credit to the Council of Chalcedon. Because the Council of Chalcedon understood that you shouldn't get hung up on a letter, right? This letter that was no good at Nicaea was good at Chalcedon. And so they should receive it. And so they did. This is how they formulated their doctrinal statement. All right. Questions on this? Let's move on to another event or challenge of the period of the Christian Empire, the tension between Rome and Constantinople. Since the Roman Empire established two capital cities early in the 4th century. Now again, this was before Constantine became a Christian. Before that, the Roman Empire was divided administratively into an eastern part and a western part. They felt that it was just becoming too big for them to effectively reign, so they essentially established two capital cities. Constantinople, which today is Istanbul, and the other important city was Rome, of course. And so, they had a constant sort of tension and competition between Rome and Constantinople. Many different things divided the eastern and the western branches of Christianity. The West used Latin, the East used Greek. They did communion a little bit differently. They used different dates for Easter. They celebrated Mass differently. In the East, clergy could marry and wear beards. In the West, clergy were supposed to shave and not wear beards. Again, and there were a lot of different... Pardon me?
Should not get married.
Shave and not get married. Is that what I said?
You said shave and not get beards.
Shave and not get beards. Well, that would be true. Because if you shave, you do not get a beard. But in addition to that, they were also supposed to not marry. Now, again, over the centuries, these divisions developed to the place where in the year 1054, the head of each church, the head of the Western Church, which was the Pope, and the head of the Eastern Church, which would have been the Patriarch of Constantinople, these two leaders of each prospective branch of Christianity in the year 1054 excommunicated each other. And when Islam finally conquered Constantinople in the year 1453, some Eastern Christians said that they would rather become Muslims than Western Roman Catholics. Deep, deep divisions between the church, East and West. And so, basically, everything in the pink area on this map over here represents the Western Empire. Everything starting with the green and over there on these, that represents the Eastern Empire. Excuse me, that's a totally erroneous thing. Here represents the dividing line approximately right about here, dividing East from West. So, this was Christendom in the year 400. But again, it was already beginning to split among Eastern lines and Western lines. Now, I have to tell you something that's important for you to understand. We are almost totally going to neglect Eastern Christianity in this survey of church history. The Eastern Orthodox churches, the Orthodox Church of Russia, of Greece, of all these smaller nations, the Syrian Orthodox Church. And it's not because these people aren't believers. It's not because they don't have important understandings and contributions to church history. It's just that, to be honest, Western Christianity has made far more of an impact upon the world than Eastern Christianity has. I mean, I want to apologize to any brothers I would have in the Eastern Orthodox Church who would disagree with that, but I just think it's sort of historically true. And besides, though certainly the Eastern Orthodox Church has a history and a heritage that's important and worthy of study, it's just not as influential, nor honestly do I find it as interesting as the study of the Western Church. And so that's why we're going to totally neglect it. I mean, I just recommend do your own reading on this because it's helpful, it's good to know, there's important things going on, but it doesn't nearly have the interest and the impact and the vibrancy of the church in the West. Okay, so that was the big division, another very important event. It didn't happen as once, but gradually over this period. Next, we have the issue of the emergence of Islam and the Islamic invasion of Europe. In the year 662, the followers of Muhammad were a persecuted band of visionaries in Arabia. 100 years later, they controlled all of Arabia, all of North Africa, all of the Palestine region, all of Persia, all of Spain, parts of India, and they were threatening France and Northern Europe. That's amazing. In 100 years, from being a small, persecuted band of visionaries to controlling all of Arabia, all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, all the Palestine region, all of Persia, all of Spain, parts of India, and again threatening France and Northern Europe. What happened to Christians in these lands that had been assimilated by Islam? Well, again, as Islam swept over the world, make no mistake about it, they swept by the power of the sword. They conquered peoples and expected those peoples to either become Muslims or submit to Islam. In other words, they didn't necessarily kill all the Jews and Christians in an area, but the Jews and the Christians had to pay a special tax in order to be allowed to live in a Muslim country. And they had to respect and honor Muslim supremacy and superiority. Basically, the Muslim attitude was, and among many Muslims today, it still is, Muslims are fine with Jews and Christians as long as they know their place. And their place is subservient to Islam. As long as that's understood, fine. You can be a Christian, and you can teach your children Christianity. You can't evangelize, you can't build new churches except to replace an old one. Nothing can be done to allow you to expand Christianity one bit, and you have to pay special taxes that reinforce your subservience to Islam. That's the basic idea. So Christian communities in these lands that Islam conquered were often persecuted or assimilated by their Islamic conquerors. You can see that as Islam begins to sweep over more and more of the Western world, you can see it come up into Spain, all over here. It's threatening now to sweep across Europe. During these years, Muslim domination was a very real threat. A turning point was in the year 732 at the Battle of Tours in France. Now there, a Frankish force, a European force, a Frankish force, defeated a Muslim army. To be honest, it was a fairly small battle. Some people describe it as just a skirmish. But it turned back the expansion of Islam into Europe. And it put a man named Charles Martel into prominence. And it established what's known as the Carolingian line, especially notable for his grandson, Charlemagne. Charlemagne was the grandson of the man who led the Frankish forces into battle against the Muslims at the Battle of Tours and stopped the advance of Islam, at least at that time, northward into Europe. It's sort of interesting how it happened. In the years 720, Islamic armies crossed the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees are the mountains that divide Spain from France. They crossed the Pyrenees into what is today southern France. They won a big battle at a place called Narbonne, and then they lost another. But listen, the Muslims were very smart fighters. When they lost, they knew how to retreat and manage things, even in defeat, so that they would be left available to fight another day. The Muslim leader was called Abdul Rahman, and he brought a force of maybe 15,000 warriors up through southern France to a place between Poitiers and Saint Martin of Tours, a place renowned for its spiritual associations. He was only about 200 miles from Paris, where the Battle of Tours was fought. Charles Martel, who without the official title was practically the king of the Frankish kingdom, comprising northern France and western Germany, this pink area that you see there. He was an experienced and popular soldier. We don't know a lot of the details of the battle, but as the battle was fought, he became famous for getting his soldiers to stand strong. Basically, in previous battles between Muslim armies and European armies, the Muslim armies were always able to break the European lines. The Frankish army here at this battle was renowned for standing strong. They stood like a wall. They did not flee in panic as other European armies had. At the end of it all, Abdul Rahman was dead, the Muslim army withdrew, and Tours was saved. Charles was given the nickname Martel, which is a pretty cool nickname because it means hammer. Charles the Hammer. I'll tell you what, if Abdul Rahman had won that battle at Tours, European history would have been very, very different. Very different. Because world history. Because for all we know, up to that point, there would have been nothing to stop the advance of Islam up through Europe. Listen, the prominent cathedrals of Europe today could have very well been mosques instead, if the advance of Islam was not stopped. And one of the places where it stopped, it wasn't the definitive battle, but it was the turning of the tide against the Muslim forces. Now, another notable thing in this regard were the Crusades. From the year 1096 to the year 1248, there were actually 7 different crusades. So when you talk about the Crusades, you're talking about a series of wars. And they had the supposed goal of protecting pilgrims and recapturing the Holy Land from Muslims, or at least with weakening Islamic influence in that part of the world. How did the Crusades start? The Crusades did not start because the Europeans wanted to expand Christianity into the former Islamic lands. It isn't because they wanted to defeat Islam. That wasn't the idea. The Crusades started with a man known as Peter the Hermit, who had been on a pilgrimage to Palestine. Peter the Hermit, on his way to the Holy Land, experienced cruel treatment from the Muslims. And he decided, when he returned to Europe, to use all of his influence to stir up Christians against the Muslims. He saw the Pope, Urban II, and the Pope approved of the First Crusade. Do you know what a crusade is? A crusade is a war fought on behalf of the cross. Peter got on his donkey, and he traveled from city to city throughout Italy and throughout France, stirring up a passion for a war, mainly to protect Christians who wanted to travel to the Holy Land. They thought it's intolerable for Christians who want to go visit Jerusalem and the Holy Land, for them to be harassed, for them to be robbed, for them to be murdered, for them to be oppressed by the Muslims who ruled that area of the world. So in the year 1095, Pope Urban II gave an impassioned appeal for an army to march to the Holy Land and win it back. He gave a very dramatic speech. And in the dramatic speech he said this: "A horrible tale has gone forth. An accursed race, utterly alienated from God, has invaded the land of the Christians and depopulated them by the sword, plundering and fire. Tear that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves." It stirred up the people. The people cried out in Latin, Deus vult, which means God wills it. God wills it. Now, how do you motivate your soldiers to fight in such a war? Pope Urban II promised that fighting in the Crusades would earn you time off of purgatory. We'll talk about purgatory in a future lecture, but purgatory was a place, let me just put it this way. You wanted to spend as little time in purgatory as possible. So, to have the Pope take time off you in purgatory, you were happy to do that. Now, what happened with the Crusades? Well, at first, there was limited success. And the Crusaders ruled Jerusalem and other notable cities for a period of time. It's hard for you to see on this particular map, but if you take a look at the area of Israel on this map, you'll see little portions of red in the midst of a sea of green. The sea of green is Islam. The little pieces of red are what is known as the Crusader Kingdoms. And again, they had some limited success. But again, it was short-lived because the areas eventually fell to Islam again. To be honest, with the kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, in 1100 stood as a Crusader kingdom. And then later on, in 1200, this strip along the Mediterranean coast, this was a Crusader outpost. But to be honest, when the Muslims started getting serious about fighting the Crusaders, they whooped them. Because there was just so many more resources and abilities available to the Muslims, they were just able to do this. And so they pretty much were able to eliminate the Crusaders when they got serious about doing it. There are many misconceptions about the Crusades. The Crusades, I think, were misguided. The Crusades were wrong. I don't think the Christians should have ever done it. It was wrong for them to do, and it was especially wrong for the church to do this, to be a part of it, the Roman Catholic Church. But the two biggest misconceptions about the Crusades are this. The idea that the Crusades were offensive wars against a peaceful Muslim Middle East is just wrong. Instead, they were the exact opposite. The Crusades were defensive wars fought in direct reaction to Muslim aggression. It was because the Muslims were aggressive against Christian visitors to the Holy Land that the Crusades started. Secondly, some people think that the purpose of the Crusades was to expand Christianity. This had nothing to do with the Crusades. It was not to expand Christianity. The reasons were more political, and as much as the reasons were spiritual, it was just so that Christians could have access to their holy places, to Jerusalem and the rest of it. What is commonly misunderstood is that there is nothing really in Christian history analogous to the Muslim spread of the Muslim faith by the sword. There's really nothing analogous. Not even the Crusades are really like the Muslims trying to spread Christianity. Because when Christians went into these areas, they didn't go for the purpose of converting. They went for the purpose of establishing safe places for Christians to visit. But the Crusades were nonetheless, I think, wicked. I think they were wrong. I think they were bizarre too. I'll give you an example of a very strange crusade. And that would be the Children's Crusade. There were actually two of them in the 1200s. There was one where a 12-year-old boy named Stephen of Cloyes inspired some 30,000 children to make a spiritually powerful, supernatural conquest of the Holy Land by what they called the pure in heart. You see, their idea was simply this. They said, look, it's a spiritual battle. If we want to defeat the Muslims over there in the Holy Land, it's going to happen if we get soldiers who are pure of heart to go do it. And who is more pure of heart than children? So we'll get an army of children to go. And it'll be a spiritual battle, and God will bless them, and it'll be amazing the way that all this happens for the glory of God. And so what did they do? Well, they set off these 30,000 children. Set off for the Holy Land. Many of them died along the way. Many of the others lost faith because they believed that the seas would part for them and they'd be able to walk there on dry ground. Most of the remaining children died at sea, were slaughtered, or sold into slavery. It's interesting. In that spring and summer of 1212, two separate but related events happened. In France, that 12-year-old shepherd boy, Stephen, saw that vision of Jesus. But then also in Germany, near Cologne, a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas claimed to have a similar vision. So thousands of these children gathered together on this very ill-fated crusade that they went off to. They began to migrate through Marseille in France, or Genoa, or Rome in Italy. And again, the estimates are that there were anywhere between 10,000 and 50,000 children in each of the two groups. Both the French and German children who were the tragic participants in these crusades suffered unspeakable hardship. Many of them were loaded onto ships to go to the Holy Land, and the ships just sailed to the slave markets of North Africa and unloaded the children there and sold them. It was an unbelievably tragic event. Finally, we want to talk now not about only the Crusades, but about the Mongol Invasion. Under this period, there were several repeated threats to European civilization. As I said before, one of the threats was of the Islamic armies coming and marching and threatening Europe. But another one was the Mongol invasion. In the year 1242, the most fearsome army ever to invade Europe turned back to the east after easily conquering almost all of Eastern Europe. In 1241, and then they set their sight on the drive all the way to Atlantic, but in 1242, they were stopped. When we talk about the Dark Ages in Europe, the Dark Ages in Europe were pure light compared to what could have happened to Europe if the Mongols would have succeeded in making their advance all the way to the Atlantic. In the year 1242, the Mongol advanced scouts probed as far as Vienna, which really would have been the next major city on their agenda. There was very little that could have stopped them. These were horse warriors from the central steppes of Asia, and they had special composite bows that were superior to any kind of technology in Europe. They fought surprisingly like a modern army in the medieval world. The only two armies that were capable of defeating them had been beaten in the year 1241, and the two battles happened within a day of each other, far distances apart. One, a large army of Germans, Poles, and Templars and Teutonic Knights marched out of Liegnitz to attack a smaller force of Mongols, but they were very decisively defeated. And then in April 10th, Bela, a Hungarian king of the city of Buda, went out against the advancing Mongol army, and with clever and bold tactics, the Mongol general won the battle and killed almost the entire army of King Bela. Now what's interesting about this is when the Mongols swept westward and attacked everything in their path, they were like the most radical anarchists and destroyers of societies that you ever saw. They were anti-city. They thought that, people should live out in the open. They thought that people should be rural. They were horse people and farmers and fierce warriors. And therefore, when they encountered cities, they just plain destroyed cities and murdered people. Their method of warfare was basically to have a calculated massacre. When a city resisted the Mongols and fell, and by the way, those cities always fell, he would have all the inhabitants of the city slaughtered. In the year 1220, the Mongol leader Genghis Khan and all of his armies killed 1.6 million people at Herat.
What was the leader's name?
Genghis Khan. K-A-H-N. When it was told the commander that some people had survived by hiding among the corpses, at the very next battle, he commanded that the head be cut off of every corpse so that they could be sure that nobody would survive. At Nishapur, it is said that they massacred 1,747,000 people. They attacked Russia, they destroyed cities, they killed hundreds of thousands of people repeatedly. Because when they conquered a city, they destroyed it completely. China's population declined more than 30% during the years of the Mongol conquest. That's how murderous they were. When the Mongols came to a city, the inhabitants were given the choice. You can surrender if you want to. If they surrendered, they'd be forced to leave the city and just wander wherever they could, and the city would be destroyed because they hated cities. Here's the point. The Mongols advanced extremely rapidly westward until they came to the outskirts of Vienna. And there was not all that far from here, right? There was very little reason to believe that they would be stopped at Vienna. Very little reason to believe. That they would just simply conquer Vienna and continue their push and make it all the way to the west. There was nothing between Vienna and the Atlantic that could have stopped them.
What was their goal of conquering cities?
Domination. Just power. Yeah, grazing lands.
So did they have mass amount of people also?
Yeah, they would repopulate areas with their own people and that. But more so anything, it was just a very destructive, conquering impulse.
What was the time frame? You said 1242?
Yeah, 1242 was when they were stopped. So I'm just going to throw out a number, say for 100 years before that.
Oh, okay, got it.
Now what's very interesting about this is that, as we discussed before, if the Muslims would have won at the Battle of Tours, Europe and the world would have been very different. Question?
Yeah, you said that they conquered just for power and stuff like that. What's like sparked them to just go on this rampage? Because they obviously have really, like, a high sense of battle, like, skills or whatever.
Absolutely.
What sparked this all of a sudden? If they knew how to do this forever, why now?
Well, because they had leaders who were willing to lead them in these great conquests. I mean, this was just a warlike people that came to power, that their culture was on the upswing, and they were able to conquer to the east of them into China, and to the south and west and north of them across Muslim lands, across Russia, and the areas of Eastern Europe today, and again sweeping eastward. They felt that the word should be different. They didn't like cities. They wanted the world to go back to an earlier time. And again, I don't think you can I don't think you can discount just the simple lust to conquer and destroy. Listen, this is a very powerful impulse within humanity. The lust to conquer and destroy is very significant. And that's what the Mongols were very, very good at. So there they were, just a few miles outside of Vienna, and the people in Vienna were scared to no end. And all of Europe was scared. Because really, it looked like they were an unstoppable force. As I said before, in the previous year, Europe took its best shot at sending 2 significant armies against the Mongols to stop them, and they failed. They just destroyed them. So it looked very bad for Vienna. Then what happened? Well, basically what happened is you could say that the death of a single man saved Europe from conquest of the Mongols. His name was Ogdai Khan. He was the leader of the Mongols, and he was the 3rd son of Genghis Khan. He had kept his father's empire alive and even expanded it. But according to Mongol law, when the Khan died, their law required that the tribal leaders go back to their homeland and elect a new Khan. So when they're there on the outskirts of Vienna, the Khan dies, they get news of it, and the tribal leaders have to go back to their homeland, to Mongolia, and go back from Vienna, from having their sights on Europe, which lay virtually bare before them, and they go back, and they never made the advance back westward again. Again, remarkable things. It's amazing to see how history could have been very different, and sometimes huge historical phenomenon rests on very small things turning. I don't know, in one sort of application, I mean, I think it should remind us to take small things more seriously. You never know how great a matter will turn on a very small thing. I don't know, I suppose I could look it up. Maybe it's recorded, maybe it's not. But you wonder what this guy, Ogdai Khan, what he died of. Maybe he died of a very small thing. I don't know, maybe he didn't. Maybe it was a big thing. Maybe he was sick for a long time and died. But he turned back the Mongol armies when no single army in Europe could have stopped them. And thus, the history of Europe turned out to be very different. So, that's going to be it for this particular lecture. This afternoon, we'll gather together and continue along, and we're starting to get into what I consider to be even more and more interesting things when we talk about the development of Christianity outside of institutional lines in the Christian world.